Good evening, boys and girls, and welcome to episode 137 of Love at First Scent with me, Persolaise, coming to you today from YouTube. And regular viewers will know, because this is the final week of videos before I kind of put the channel to sleep for a little while, because it's going to go on a bit of hibernation for the month of November, I decided we're going to go out with a bang with a whole week of really exciting interviews. And this is the first of the 3 interviews that I've got lined up for you for this week. And it is with somebody who is a really interesting figure in the perfume world. And what I mean by that is that she's somebody who is a rare example of the kind of person who's actually managed to do a crossover or a few crossovers from one discipline or from one field of work to another. She is Barbara Herman, who a lot of you will be aware of, but you may not have realized that she started her professional life as a writer, and I'm sure she'll tell us all about this in a few moments, but then she crossed over, if you like, into the world of perfume by being a perfume writer, and then she crossed over further into the perfume world, but by actually being the founder of a perfume brand, the brand Eris, some of whose work you can see here, all of whose perfumes have been composed by Antoine Lie. So I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot about writing, a lot about vintage perfumes. Barbara is the author of Scent Subversion, which is a book all about vintage scents. So if you have questions about vintage perfumes, you need to be thinking of them now. And I'm sure we'll be talking about her latest scent as well. But anyway, here we go, live from New York. Please welcome to the virtual studio, Barbara Herman. Hi, Barbara. Thanks for making the time.
Hello, everyone.
How are you doing today?
Welcome to my living room in Brooklyn. I'm well, thanks.
Isn't it weird, but also amazing that we can do this? Here I am in the south of England, and you're in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
And we've got lots and lots of comments already. Hang on to your questions, folks, as remember, there will always be a time when I will sort of say, okay, send your questions in now, but we have to let a few people say hello. So Rich Mitch is saying, love vintage. Is there anybody who ever says, I hate vintage? Kim Tuft says, Scent Subversion is a tremendous book. Oh, and Rich Mitch is saying, hello, Barbara, and your living room. Dariush says, hi, Persolaise. So excited to see you talking to Barbara. Keep the comments coming, folks. My first question to you, Barbara, if we can sort of start in a way by putting you on the spot, is, as the queen of knowledge, this fount of knowledge with vintage perfumes, before the world went a little bit crazy and we found ourselves in the situation that we're in now, what was the last really exciting vintage find that you made?
Oh, wow. I kind of did I amassed a huge cache, I guess is the word, of vintage years and years ago. So I tend to be extreme about the things that I do, and I hadn't really collected much since then. If I do collect something, it's a vintage from like maybe 30 years ago, which is, you know, I guess still vintage, but the most exciting vintages for me were always the 20s, 30s, 40s fragrances. But I mean, I guess to sort of answer your question, post the time that I was amassing all of those vintage fragrances, I did find a 50s, 60s era Witchy, which I know you just talked about. And it was so powerful, the civet and everything else that was in it, that you could smell it even with the glass, the ground glass stopper inside the bottle. And to this day, I still have it because I can't open it. And that people have given me so many tips on how to get that stopper out. I've gotten to the point where I think I'm going to take it to like a glass specialist and have them do it for me, because it's this elixir is inside this beautiful bottle. I can smell it. I know that once it comes out, it's going to be like this crazy genie. It's going to smell so good, but I cannot get it out, and I don't want to smash it. And
so you've never been able to open it?
No. And that was a few years ago that I got it. But I mean, I have smelled vintage Witchy, of course, but this particular one, I don't know what I'm waiting for, but you know, maybe when we change presidents, I will crack that open like a bottle of champagne.
Please notice Barbara said when.
I know. I'm going to knock on wood right now.
I know, but mind you, the day will come. We shouldn't get political here, but it'll either come next week or it'll come in 4 years' time. There will be a change of president eventually, one way or another, right?
All right.
Okay, so let's go back a little bit, Barbara. Is that really, really brief summation that I gave correct? That first it was the writing, then it was the perfume writing, and then it was the perfume creation, or the brand founding. Is that how it went?
It is. And, the word journey is so overused in marketing, but it was a journey. And it was something that I fell into because first I was an academic. I sound like a fugitive with all these different things that I hop to. Maybe that's my personality as, an immigrant, really. I moved to the States with my family at age 3, and I'm like half Vietnamese, half German American. So I'm kind of like all over the place, hopefully in a good way. But so I started out as an academic, and then I left grad school and became a writer for a pop culture website in San Francisco. And it was around that time, around 2007, that I just discovered like all of these people online writing about perfume and hearing these evocative names, and then I started reading the books, and before I knew it, I was like, okay, I got to get my hands on some of these vintage perfumes. And so
had the love of perfume always been there? Were you somebody who always wore perfume?
Yes, and it's something that I had kind of done without thinking that I had the cultural permission to think about perfume, write about perfume, and it was around that time that I was like, oh, wait, everybody's doing this. So now I'm intrigued. So I started a very modest vintage perfume collection that I would keep in my refrigerator in my tiny apartment in San Francisco. And it was probably Chanel number 19 and the vintage Lanvins that prompted me like, okay, wait a minute. There's too much going on here. I have to put it down somewhere. So I just kind of, on an offhand way, started a blog. And because I knew some SEO stuff from my job, before I knew it, people started asking me questions as if I knew anything more than they did. And eventually I kind of did know a little bit to share with people, but it was mostly just like a record of my discoveries.
Tell me more about cultural permission. That's an intriguing term.
Well, I think perfume has such a low status culturally. There are even perfumers who are like, yeah, it's not art, it's, whatever. But to me, anything that can truly move you and make you think about the world in a different way is art. And so just seeing people take perfume seriously, I think is what I mean. And, learn the dates of when the composition was made, who made it, what the history of ingredients were. I just kind of opened up a world of discovery for me. And it was when I realized that these were not just aesthetic issues, that there was actually sort of like a culturally relevant reason that certain fragrances were popular at certain times. That's really when the window opened wide for me, because I had studied rhetoric at UC Berkeley, and the whole department was interdisciplinary. So, there's this idea that no matter what the object of study is, there's going to be a way to kind of tie that back up into rhetoric and culture and politics and sociology and all of that stuff. And I've discovered that was the case with perfume.
Now, your book is called Scent Subversion. When did you start seeing perfume as something subversive, or wearing perfume as something subversive?
Mm-hmm. Well, it prompted memories. You asked me if I'd always been interested in perfume. And the fact is I had been. And I realized this when I started thinking about perfume, because I had all these memories of, when I wore this, or how I felt about someone who wore this fragrance, and all of it sort of came back to me. And so I did a sort of retrospective analysis of that. And one of the first things I remembered is that when I was in high school in Texas, for a brief time, I was in a private school and we had to wear uniforms. And I couldn't express myself in any way. If I wore socks that were a different color from the code, I would get in trouble for it. If I wore a red jacket, I would get sent to the office and they'd take my jacket away for a particular period of time. And I was like, this is like ridiculous. How can I, have a signature and not just wear a uniform? And one of my favorite fragrances at the time, this was in the late 80s, was Jeffrey Bean's gray flannel.
Gray flannel. Yeah.
Green. Yeah, gray flannel. And so I wore that sort of unselfconsciously at first, but then I started realizing, hey, this is a men's fragrance and that's kind of subversive and no one can tell me to take this perfume off. Because it was Texas and it was the high time of like Giorgio, Polo, like all of these screeching fragrances. So by the 80s standards, gray flannel was a very subtle office scent,
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm sure you said because people are intrigued by your Jiki bottle because Joanna here is saying, gosh, there's a short story there about the unopened Jiki bottle. Yeah. And you said you've been given lots and lots of tips. So I suspect you've had this tip already, but Rich Mitch says, put it in the freezer for 10 minutes.
I know, I did it. You know what I think? I think that all of these tips work. They just need to be put in the hands of somebody who has a little bit less investment and obsession with them, or not obsession, but who can be ginger and strong at the same time. Because I think I'm just so nervous about breaking the entire thing that I try all these things, and I don't care about the bottle. Like if the bottle shatters into a million pieces, I don't care, but I don't want to lose, it's an extrait too. So I don't want to lose that stuff.
No, I have a feeling that from all across the world, people watching this are all kind of thinking, no, you mustn't ruin the juice inside. So there's this collective will to help you open this bottle.
Yeah.
Okay. So, obviously fast forwarding very, very quickly through your life story, but one day you found yourself as the founder of a brand. So how on earth does one start a perfume brand? And not only how on earth does one start a perfume brand, but how on earth does one get Antoine Lie, one of the greats, as their perfumer? So how did that happen?
Well, just to sort of step backward a little quickly. So after I was into the blog about a year and a half, I realized, whoa, I really want to write a book. There's just too much to say. I love like getting comments from people and it prompts things for me to write. And I loved all that, but I was like, I really want to put this all in a book. I want to like actually also collect vintage ads. And so I quit my job in San Francisco. I gathered some of my money and I moved to New Orleans, which is my favorite city in the country. And I started writing there. And it was, after I did the sort of like historical and also idiosyncratic reviews of fragrances through the, decades, there was a back section to Scent and Subversion, which was my interviews with some people I consider scent visionaries. And Antoine was one of them because, when I was discovering perfume, I really became obsessed with État Libre d'Orange. And I thought all of their fragrances, their names, their concepts were so interesting. And like everybody else, I got hazed, as I say, in the in the smelling of Sécrétion Magnifique phase. So I started collecting some of his perfumes, and I love them. And I loved his style. So after I interviewed him about Sécrétion Magnifique, it was a couple years later. Was it before the book? Yeah, I think it was before the book was published, but after I'd written it, that I was like, I wonder what it would be like to actually start a line and create not replicas of vintage fragrances, but fragrances that have that kind of boldness and that vision. And, so I just kind of offhandedly asked him, is this something you'd be interested in doing? And, I described what I kind of wanted for the first collection. And I had reached out to a couple other perfumers because my idea was to have like 3 fragrances in different perfume categories. And, you know, it is daunting to get in touch with some of these major perfumers when, you know, they don't know you from Adam. And so he was really the only perfumer who was like, I love this idea, you know, let's talk about it. And so one of the categories of the perfumes I wanted to make was a, you know, floral animalic. And he was always going to be the animalic fragrance guy anyway. But when he sent me some of the mods after we had a conversation, I was like, these are so beautiful. Like, I can't say goodbye to any of them. So why don't you just do the first 3? And we've just kind of developed a way of working together that works for me. But I think, you know, to answer your question, how do you even get in touch with Antoine Lie? You know, it was through État Libre d'Orange first. I got in touch with Etienne de Schwart because I had been talking to him when I was still just blogging and like sending him perfume ideas and crazy names. And he's like, who are you? But eventually he was like, okay, yeah, here's Antoine's email. You know, you can send him whatever you want. But I guess I already had it from the interview. But in any case, he was open to it. And, you know, we are still working.
No, that is great because from my perspective, from an outsider's perspective, it's such a good fit because I think he is somebody, certainly you can see through his work for you, his work with you, that he is so acutely aware of the past and yet doesn't want to do a pastiche. This is still about making something new, but being rooted in the past. So in terms of the process, I'm hoping it's okay for us to talk about this, about Green Spell.
Totally.
Because it's not actually available yet, although I saw that on your site you're taking pre-orders for it, and I think your site says that it'll start shipping in January.
Yes.
Now, the name, for those of you watching, is a bit of a giveaway because this is as green. I mean, it's so green that it almost starts becoming like hypersaturated green turning into white. Because the notes list, anything that's green that you can think of, you know, from galbanum to violet leaf to fig to tomato leaf, it's in this thing. Yeah. So I was wondering, while I spray some, if you could tell us about the process of how this came about, like, you know, whose idea was it? How did we get to the point where we now have this addition to your range?
So if you know about Eris, you know that the first 3 fragrances are intense floral animalics. The 4th one is, you know, gender fluid, soft sandalwood with benzoin and spices. And then the 5th one is like a super animalic flanker of mix with real ambergris and hyraceum. So clearly I like the, you know, super sensual animalic stuff, and wanted to sort of branch out because actually really like I said, the first idea for the trio, I wanted to do a green fragrance at the beginning, but ended up falling so in love with all of these 3 florals that we did those. So I was like, okay, I need to do a green. I want to do a green. And so a couple years ago, the way, you know, the thinking process is I want to do a green fragrance. I want to do a witchy fragrance. So whether the name or the style or something about the story is going to be about becoming intoxicated by nature, by the things that reference nature in perfume. And, you know, I do bounce the names off of Antoine because I respect him so much and I don't want to name something that he's going to be like, not want to be attached to. So for example, my initial names were very like teenage goth. They were like the Devil's Garden or the Witch's Garden or, you know, Gothica, like all of these like really cheesy names. And I ran a few past him and he was like, Barbara, please don't call it, you know, Le Jardin de la Diable or whatever I was coming up with. And so for some reason, this one was really hard to name. And then finally I was like, I think I want to call it Green Spell because I want it to cast a spell. I want it to cast a spell of positivity not darkness, because we were dealing with just so much stuff this year. But I still want it to have that edge. So that's kind of, I gave him a list. So this is always how all the fragrance things work with us, is I give him a list of notes that I really love. I give him a list of contemporary perfumes in that category I like, vintage perfumes in the category I like, the effect I want. I've said this before and it sounds like really pretentious, but it's kind of the easiest way to explain it, is I really think of perfume in terms of cinema. And so I like to think about myself as like, I'm the director and I cast the movie, and, I kind of know how I want it to look and feel and what the story is, but I don't have the technical expertise to do it. So I want to work with a cinematographer, in this case, Antoine, who can take what I'm throwing at him, because sometimes it's pictures, sometimes it's, but it's always what I just told you. Perfumes, notes, feelings, potential.
So would you be willing to reveal what some of the vintage references were for this?
Oh, for sure. Alliage, Van Ver, and it's less like, oh, I want you to replicate these fragrances. It's just, I want that intensity, or I want that momentary softness. Like, it's green, but it's also going somewhere.
No, I've been really, really taken with this one. I mean, I love greens. Why do you think greens are a hard sell, though? Because greens seem to have this real aficionado quality to them.
I have no idea. I do have an idea. I think part of it is that it's in the lexicon of people who love vintage and, who love 70s, even 80s fragrances. But once we get to the 90s, and this is sort of my, Jeremiah or whatever in my book, is that once we get to the 90s, even though there are beautiful fragrances in the 90s, don't get me wrong, there seemed to be what I call olfactory arrested development. Like, nothing else could get into this sort of clean, safe, gets along with everybody, can wear it to the office, nobody's going to raise an eyebrow. And I think green fragrances, even though I think if you wore Green Spell or other green fragrances into the office, nobody's going to raise an eyebrow. But even for you, like you said, you sprayed initially, it's intense. And I think that kind of intensity that was in fragrances in the past, for some reason in the 90s, that became like verboten. So I think it's really just a matter of not being aware of that category. It's that simple to me, because I feel like once people become aware of the category, let's say they start collecting vintage perfume, or there's a perfumer that they like and they smell something green, if they like it, then they realize. But I think it's just a matter of palate, If you, like, I grew up in Texas, and even though there's a lot of good food in Texas, don't get me wrong, it wasn't until I moved to New York and could try everything that I realized, oh, I like this or I like that. And just because I ate, like burgers and, tacos in Texas doesn't mean that that's all I liked. It just means that I didn't really know that there was all this other stuff. So I really think it's just a matter of knowing what's out there, getting acquainted with a variety of styles and categories so that you can figure out what you actually like.
And tell us about the process. So Antoine is based in Paris?
Yes.
So I guess a lot is done by phone calls, by email. He sends you mods.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all of the above.
And what were some of the particular challenges and stumbling blocks with this? Was it a case of making it more green, less green? Were some of the materials particularly problematic?
I think and this is a nice problem to have, is that with Antoine, everything he gives you is so good, it's hard to choose which direction to go into. So actually, for quite some time, we were working on a different fragrance that had galbanum and was a little bit more on the sensual side, but this was a mod that I kept returning to. My friends and family who I would spray it for were like, this is amazing. And so you know, it's a process of narrowing it down. And then once like I'm locked into an idea and say, okay, this is the one, we got to keep playing around with this one. That's
How long did this one take to make?
Took about 1.5 2 years, and we were actually able to meet in person a few times, because, you know, in the before times I would visit, you know, Aix-en-Provence, or I was traveling a lot last year. I'm really glad I did, because I'm not going anywhere this year. But yeah, I met him a couple times in Paris. We met in Milan for other things, but you know, he would always have new mods for me. And when we can't meet, yeah, he sends them through the mail. We have a conversation. And I guess the sort of, just to sort of give some insider stuff, the fragrance started off very synthetic. And it was, you know, well, if you think this is green with these naturals, imagine it like turbocharged with the synthetic greens. And, you know, I liked it, but it kind of scared me a little bit. And I'm like, okay, if this scares me, we need to tone this down and like give it some room to breathe or something. It was sort of like, the way I joke about it was that it was sort of like being attacked by, you know, the plant world. And I wanted the relationship that people have to it to be a little bit more consensual, you know? So, and so, you know, I said, you know, I know that you have access to beautiful narcissus and natural galbanum, and, you know, let's throw some naturals in here so that it can soften up a little bit and develop a little bit. And that's
I wanted to ask specifically about that, because your website makes a point of mentioning that it's Iranian galbanum. Yeah. Is there any reason why you kind of want to point that out?
I think Iranian galbanum is supposed to be superior. And I always include like where the ingredients are from, because I know that the people who are sourcing it and Antoine's composing with that in mind, like we're going to get the best stuff. And also to indicate that it's natural. You know, yeah, that's really kind of primarily why I do that.
You've made a few perfumes with Antoine now, and to go back to your analogy of, you know, you're like the film director who's got this crew. Do you now find that you have to direct him a little bit less than you used to, because he kind of gets you? Do you have a sort of shorthand now?
That's a hard question. I don't think it was ever. I think we kind of hit the ground running. We always, if anything, I was the one who had to learn how to talk about things, and to learn that if I didn't like something, that we should shift it to something else. I mean, it's actually been a pretty easy process. He's very like, you know, I mean, obviously super professional. And even though I'm, you know, just one person, I'm not like, you know, a huge corporation. He's like, you're the client, and you know, it's actually very easy.
Okay, no,
and because I love perfume so much, the way I describe it to him, he gets what it is that I'm talking about pretty easily.
Did you find that your own knowledge of perfumery and of the technicalities of perfumery improved and increased through this process of making these scents?
I think technicality, no, because I don't think I have any proficiency in that, and I wouldn't pretend to. But I think if anything has changed, it's kind of like, you know, when you make something, you learn so much about it that you wouldn't if you were just consuming it. So for, you know, like if you're cooking and you finally make like a beef bourguignon or something like that, you're like, whoa, so much goes into this. That's, if I've learned anything, it's that there's so many nuances, there's so many choices to make, and it's very hard to finally say it's done. That's the hardest part.
Interesting little comment here from regular viewer Ashfaq on greens. He's saying that most green perfumes have the conflicting combination of austerity, playful animalic, incense, leather, and medicinal bitter qualities, which a lot of people aren't a fan of. I mean, I guess I would agree with that in the sense that they can be quite challenging. Green perfumes are in a way the most challenging, I guess. Would you agree?
I mean, I guess with all of his descriptors there, I would kind of wrap it up into one word, which is that it's very intense.
Yeah.
You know, if you want to wear perfume and kind of, and I primarily wear any fragrances for myself, but particularly green fragrances, and this one, I want to have an experience with it. So I like having that, blast, which is really what happens at the beginning, just this blast of green, and then watching the development as it goes on. So that's not why a lot of people wear perfume, and so I can understand.
Yes.
If they first smell that blast and are like, oh, I don't want to be that intense, or I don't want to be that sharp or challenging or something like that. That's fine. I get it.
I want to go back to a word that you used a few minutes ago, because that's actually in some of the notes that I made in preparation for today. You said that you wanted green spell to be witchy or witch-like. And actually, that's a word that I would use to describe all of your perfumes to a certain extent. I mean, Eris is the goddess of chaos, isn't she?
Yes.
So I don't know if all along you had wanted your perfumes to have a dangerous edge. Their names, Night Flower, My Beast, Belle du Jour, all of that. They all seem to cast a kind of spell, those names. I'm guessing this is no coincidence.
No, I mean, and it's not anything like, conscious necessarily. I mean, definitely the name is, Eris and the goddess. I really love this idea of this goddess who's kind of cast out and causing trouble, but she's mischievous and funny and kind of a gadfly. Wait, oh, now I'm lost. Like, what was the question?
No, just are they all witchy? Is the kind of signature in a way that they're all meant to have an edge? They're all meant to have some kind of bite.
Well, I mean, the sort of tagline for Eris is that it's unconventional beauty and subversive glamour. So there's always going to be some subliminal or not so subliminal sense that there's, you're doing something a little bit dangerous by wearing these fragrances, and that, is in keeping with the fragrances that I fell in love with when I was writing Scent Subversion, and the, sort of anti-office scent state that I want to put in the ground. So
now, I would love to spray another one as well. And by the way, folks, start sending in your questions now, because I want to make sure that you have as much of an opportunity to ask questions of Barbara as possible, because you're probably wanting to know lots and lots of things about vintage perfumes. I would love to spray Night Flower here. And while I do that, please tell me how this perfume came about, because as you may be aware, I just think this is so, so, so beautiful. And I'm glad that I finally came round to it. I think it took me a while to sort of discover it and be ready to discover it. So while I drift off to the heavens, tell us how this came about.
Well, there are a lot of fragrance brands out there, so I can see that it would take a while. So as I said, like the initial trio, I wanted them to be animalic. I wanted them to sort of have a contrasting, floral element, kind of a play with light and dark. And so, I love tuberose, and I wanted to have a twist. And I'm sure there's something else to tell you about this one. I can give you some sort of directives that I mentioned to Antoine. I said,
yes,
like when I smelled some of the vintage fragrances from the 20s and 30s that were floral animalics, I remember when I smelled them feeling like the ground had dropped out beneath me. And it was because of those animalics. They had an immediate effect, even with all of those years spanning the time the bottle was filled to reaching me and, 2007 or whatever. And I just thought, and I remember smelling, I think it was a Bulgari vintage by Lanvin. I was watching a movie. I was with a bunch of friends. I had just gotten some Bulgari from eBay. And, I'm always having to do 10 things at once. So I remember opening up the bottle in the theater and putting it on. And to this day, I remember that moment because I was overwhelmed by how beautiful it was, by that effect of the animalic notes. And so with Night Flower, I wanted that effect. And I said to him, and this is one of the sort of non-perfumey directives, but I said, can you make something that feels like you're at the top of a roller coaster and you're about to like swoop down, that moment where you almost feel a little queasy, or that feeling when you're falling in love and it's not entirely 100% wonderful. It's in fact a bit terrifying. Like all of those sort of queasy but exciting feelings. I wanted that from the top notes to the base. And I remember smelling the mod that worked for the first time and just being so astounded that he somehow managed to for me, create that effect of from the top notes to the base notes of feeling that swoop, that plunge.
This is, I mean, this stuff for me, I always just think has got this purr. It really, really purrs, maybe even just growls, but it's an animalic that to me just quietly pounces on you. I was wondering if you were going to say shalimar. Not that it's an obvious kind of, because obviously, as you say, there's a tuberose note in there, but there's something of the soul of shalimar. I don't know whether that's.
No, you're absolutely right. And in fact, I mean, I didn't even know this when Antoine was creating it, but he had the structure of shalimar in mind. The just replacing sort of the skeleton of it with more modern notes. But shalimar is definitely a reference.
Interesting.
And I know that when Eau Parfum in Paris, when they did a little discovery set and they asked to have Night Flower in it, I was so happy to know that, you know, in their sort of review section, a few of the women who had purchased it were like, oh my God, you know, and it's not like I want this to be like a parfum de cours. If you like Shalimar, you'll love Shalimar. I mean, no, that's not what we want. But it must have that effect because there were some French women saying, I haven't felt this in love with a perfume since I tried Shalimar.
Fascinating. Now, you mentioned discovery sets. Is there a discovery set that people can order from your site so that they can try your perfumes? There
is, and for right now, I don't have international shipping, but I keep saying this, and I really mean it. I'm working on it, and it is going to happen.
Because honestly, those of you out there watching, if you have not tried Eris Parfums, you really need to make a point of doing so. You'll see from the review that I posted on my blog a little while ago, I think that they are just so beautiful collectively. We're going to get to some questions in a moment because they're coming through. But I just wanted to ask you as well, I'm fascinated, what is the line for you between vintage and contemporary? So at what stage, for example, do you say to Antoine, no, we need to do such and such here because otherwise it's just going to start smelling too retro? What is that boundary?
Well, I think, you know, the first three fragrances really were the self-consciously, actively wanting to reference vintage fragrances. But Mix and Mix XXX and Green Spell, you know, the only connection to vintage is that I always include vintage in the array of fragrances that I like when we're, you know, developing it. But I think post Mabette, Night Flower, Belle de Jour, there isn't necessarily a vintage connection. It's just, also remember that Antoine he's just so into vintage fragrances too, and has such a connection to classical fragrances that if it's there, it's not conscious necessarily.
Okay.
I'm hoping that, you know, Mix and Mix XXX and Green Spell don't smell vintage, but I think because that has kind of been my background and the sort of pitch for the first three fragrances that now people find those connections where they
filter through.
Yeah.
Okay, you've got to expect some questions like this, Barbara. Brady says, what are your thoughts on vintage Nerma?
I mean, I'm going to have the most banal answer. Like, I do love it. From what I remember, and it's been a long time since I have smelled that, is that it's kind of like a milky rose that has an interesting chemically aspect to it that I actually like. But that's something that I can only remember because I haven't smelled it in probably 10 years at least.
Okay. Do you which one or two old perfumes do you think are in particularly good condition nowadays?
I would say all the Lanvins. I am blown away by how good those things hold up, and they're cheap. You can get My Sin, if you and get it, in a box if you can, because it's not that much more expensive than if you just got, a bottle. My goodness, the quality of these fragrances are amazing, and you are going to feel, if not entirely smell, what the perfumer meant for you to feel and smell back in the day. One of the things I said in my book is a lot of people are like, well, vintage perfumes aren't going to smell the same. They're going to smell stale or whatever. And I mean, the fact is if you keep them, if the person kept them properly, it's kind of like, would you say you wouldn't go to a museum to see a 500-year-old painting because something's chipped from the corner? No, you still get the effect, slightly faded or whatever, but you're still going to get the effect. And with a lot of these fragrances, and Lanvin comes to mind. I don't know what they put in this stuff, but it lasts and lasts and lasts. And it smells
Interesting.
Yeah.
Here's one inevitable question as well from Diwad. Do you want to work with oud?
I would not kick it out of bed. Let's just put it that way. But it would have to be really, really good oud. I would probably want it to be real oud and not synthetic oud. So yeah, I would be open to that. Although I know people are ouded out.
Yeah. Another Guerlain question. If you've had any experiences with Jadi and Garlila, what were they? What can you tell us about your experiences with those two?
Oh, wow. Not the second one, but Jadi for sure. And actually, if you go to my blog, which I haven't written on for years and years and years, but there's a review of Jadi there. I'm pretty sure. If not, it's in the book, but I'm pretty sure it's on the blog. Jadi, oh my God. I really felt like I was, and I've said this about other vintage fragrances, but it had this effect of like opening up this black velvet curtain and being able to look into a world of the past and ancient rituals. And this was a very witchy fragrance to me. And I think I might have even mentioned that, but it had this sense that it was just, this like magical spell had been cast over these intensely dark notes.
Yeah.
And I think I spent $20 on a quarter of a milliliter, like this much.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
So and even just that tiny little amount had that effect.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, if you have the good stuff, you don't have to have a lot of it.
Yura's asking for a kind of explanation. When you say animalic, specifically in what way? Question goes on. I'm always intrigued by this term because I think there are different expressions of animalic accords or notes in perfume, warm, sensual, or dirty. So what do you mean when you say animalic?
All of the above. Warm, sensual, dirty, intimate. There's a sense that the fragrance is melding onto your skin in a way that doesn't feel like it's sitting on top, but becomes part of you. In the first 3 Eris fragrances, Antoine did something, interesting and fun with Belle de Jour, which is, creating a kind of almost like a human animalic, which is what he did with Sécration Magnifique, to a kind of polarizing effect. And I think that maybe in Belle de Jour too is polarizing. Not a lot of people like it, but a lot of people love it. And it's that seaweed, and so it's like soft and warm, but then it gets salty, like, skin after a day at the beach. And so animalic, I think it's got a quality of being lived in, of being alive. And as we know, things that are alive and things that are organic are not perfect. They change. They are not sometimes always pleasant, but there's a sense of intimacy that I like a lot, and emotionality. That's what I mean by animalic. But, there's also the smell.
Yeah, and then there's a very, very particular type of physicality about animalics as well, isn't there? Have you ever come across a perfume that actually you think is in better shape in its modern version than any of the vintages you may have smelt?
That is hard to say.
Almost like a case of a sequel being better than the original, except not quite. I mean, the analogy isn't perfect, but
I don't want to be sacrilegious here and say Femme by Rochas, but I think,
my goodness, that is pretty sacrilegious.
don't riot, people. I have a caveat here.
Okay.
What I mean is that I can completely love and appreciate like the uber vintage Rochas Femme, but I think the ones subsequent, not like the ones now necessarily, I don't know what they smell like now, but the ones in the 50s and 60s, or maybe even the 80s, I don't know, there's a touch of cumin or something in them that I really appreciate, and that kind of modern touch helped me appreciate it more, but I completely love the vintage. So I'm qualifying this answer. It doesn't mean that I love it more. I just thought the tweak for a more modern audience worked for me. Okay.
Please send all complaints straight to Barbara, not to me. And then kind of related question, Lannon says, can you think of any current contemporary modern perfumes that may be future vintage gems?
I think Naomi Goodsir's Baccarat de Nuit, is that?
Or Nuit de Bacalique, the tuberose.
Nuit de Bacalique. Oh my God, that is amazing. I love that fragrance. So hands down, that one.
Absolutely. And Joanna says, not a question, but a big thank you to Barbara for including de Saint-Phal in her book. I never knew she created a scent. It was a special moment when I saw Nikki's name in the book.
Yeah, and you should check out, Johanna, yesterday's Perfume, because I have an even longer post about it there and interesting biographical details about her. She's a perfect Eris figure, actually.
Which brand out there do you think is doing modernity in perfume well? Future thinking.
Oh wow. I would have to really think about that, because I, kind of become very self-absorbed with Eris, and it's very rare. It's usually only when I'm like developing a new fragrance that I'm like, oh, what's going on out in the world here? So that's something I would have to think about, but I will.
No, okay. No, that's fair enough. I mean, the question stems a little bit from my personal interest, because I always think that conveying a sense of the future in smell is so difficult, because actually one of the ways in which smell works is by making associations. Yeah. And how do you make an association with something that you've never encountered? Yeah. I always think that Mugler's cologne, the one by Alberto Marias, that somehow weirdly smelt of the future to me. Mm-hmm. Are there any perfumes that you've kind of smelt where that made you think, wow, this is kind of out there in a different sort of way?
Well, I mean, I have to say, and this is not just because I love Antoine's work, but I have recently started, I smelled his new line with Maison Sybarite, and I thought that the delivery system was really interesting because it's water-based, and yet fragrances last a really long time. So maybe, delivery systems make the perfume, or the, components make it modern. I mean, there's so many directions you could go with that. It's like, how what's actually in the fragrance and how it gets delivered on the skin, or the notes or the ideas. It's a great question, but I haven't really given it a lot of thought. So.
Now, this 4-letter abbreviation has come up, which you may have thought it might. Augustus is saying, is your work non-IFRA compliant? Now, I'm guessing we can deal with that fairly quickly, because I'm sure it is IFRA compliant.
It is IFRA compliant, but there are notes that I want to use that IFRA bans, and I'm still, if I can make a super ultra niche fragrance that, no one is going to sue me for if they get a reaction, I probably will use.
Which, well, you heard it here first, maybe. But what I'm interested in is, do you think IFRA are the bad guys, or is it too simplistic to just blame the demise of our favorite classic perfumes on them?
I don't know a lot about IFRA, except that I do blame the demise of a lot of classic fragrances and the inability to use certain ingredients on them. I agree with a lot of people who have talked about this at length, that if you can smoke cigarettes, you should be able to wear any perfume you want, and, buyer beware. I'd even be willing to put, those ghoulish photos that are on certain European pack of cigarettes with, people, something that looks like it should be by the pack of cigarettes. I'd be willing to put a photo of people with red patches on their skin. Be careful if you use this, something might happen to you, and don't get back to me about it. And I know that there are people who would do that if they, in order to smell certain ingredients that they have no access to. And so, I mean, look, I don't know. The world is not safe. I don't think you're going to die from any of these ingredients. So I think, they should loosen up a little bit. But
I have to ask you then, what are some of these notes and materials that you would like to use?
I want to use Costas. I want Costas Absolute in a perfume. Whether it's in a tiny amount, whether it's in a huge amount, but I can't. And it's driving me crazy. So that's the one in particular that I have.
This seems to have got quite a bit of a response. Darius says, sell it with a label saying not for use on skin. We'll use it properly anyway.
I know.
Paul says, health warnings on boxes, easy. And somebody saying, sing it, Barbara. What do you think is the current state of the industry then? Do you, with over 2,000 releases every single year, do you think most of it is bland nothing? Do you think the gems are being obscured by the fact that there is so much out there? Well, how do you feel when you think of the current perfume industry?
I do think it is oversaturated, like I'm sure a lot of people think. If it's oversaturated with, 2,000 brands, with owners who are like, I love perfume, I have something to say, I want to put something out there. Who would I be to say, maybe you should just not do that? But we know that that's not entirely the case. So I think it's less about the number and the saturation than what are your motivations? Do you really think that you're putting something in the world that isn't there or that the world needs? I think that's kind of.
And are you already working on the next few things with Antoine? Is that how it goes? Are you already 2 years ahead, 3 years ahead?
There is a little inkling of something that we've started talking about. So yeah.
Has the current situation made that difficult? I mean, in terms of production of your work, obtaining materials, ingredients, what's happening with all of that?
I mean, for Green Spell, we're working with a lab in Milan. It's actually Luca Maffei's lab, Atelier Fragranza Milano. And so obviously Italy has had problems, New York has had problems. So there have been some slowdown, but we're still moving ahead and working. So I would just say, if anything, it's just been the sort of pall that's been cast over everything. It's been really depressing and scary. And in New York, we're out of the weeds mostly. But April and May was terrifying. I mean, if we had this conversation in April or May, we probably wouldn't be able to, because you would just hear sirens every 5 minutes, ambulances every 5 minutes. It was really, really bad. But now it's, we're just like everybody else, just kind of, things are slower, but we're moving along.
We'll give the final comment to Eura saying the market is oversaturated with bottled ethyl maltol.
Oh, okay. I mean, yeah, I agree.
Barbara, thank you so much for your time, and thank you everybody for watching and sending questions in. The final question will be from me, again putting you on the spot, because I introduced you as somebody who's crossed over from these various disciplines. What do you think the next crossover is going to be? What's the next big Barbara Herman project going to be? Or is this it now? Have you found your calling?
No, there's always going to be something else. Either like, a novel or another nonfiction book or a shop. I would really like to have a shop.
As in an Eris boutique?
Yeah, an Eris boutique with maybe like a few of my favorite other fragrances where there would be, educational nights and cocktail and perfume smelling nights, things like that. That's my little fantasy. So if there are any investors out there watching,
do it. That'll be another reason for me to come over to New York.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you very much, Barbara. And for those of you watching live, please don't forget we've got another interview, same time tomorrow. It's the Academy Award nominated actor Richard E. Grant, who also happens to be the founder of a perfume brand. And then on Friday, it's Simon Constantine, formerly of Lush Perfumes, and now the founder of his own brand called And Perfume. But I'll let you say a final word, Barbara, if you'd like to.
Oh, it's just a really fun conversation. Thank you for your questions. And yeah, we should do this again.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Take care, everybody. See you soon. Bye.